All right. Good afternoon. I'm very excited to have Dr. Jason Evans here with us today. He's associate professor at Stetson University up in DeLand, Florida. And I think, became aware of Jason through the Florida Wildlife Corridor work that we do, and his interactions with the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council, which is sort of a semi-governmental institution, one of 10 around Florida, that does a lot of really good work at the interface of land use and development planning. And Jason is, I think, maybe not unique, but relatively unique among academics in being incredibly plugged into applied questions and application of his science. And he works quite a bit with the Regional Planning Council out there. Jason has been a great visitor already today. He's doing a lot of work that is relevant to many different things that we do in the conservation program. Obviously, he's going to speak about his work with Lake Annie. And so I've really enjoyed talking to him, and I think folks will at the happy hour as well afterwards, about the range of things he does, which includes sea level rise work with coastal communities, both from the sort of physical environment perspective and thinking about where people are going to be moving as sea level comes up. He has done some work on environmental or ecological services with pine plantations in North Florida, and now does a lot on water quality and how land cover change affects it. So I will not steal his thunder, but he's here to talk to us about Pistia stratiotes, one of the interesting, maybe native, maybe not species. He will tell us. So without further ado, thank you for being here, Jason.
Great. So it is wonderful to be here. So thank you so much, Joshua. So yeah, water lettuce and Pistia, it's what I call my hobby project. And it's kind of a science drama story in some ways. And so I'm going to take you through the whole story, and we will get to Lake Annie. And what's funny is I only saw Lake Annie in person for the first time this morning. And so I've been thinking about Lake Annie for a long time, but it was nice to actually be there. Yeah, I can stand. There we go, right there we go, right there. All right, so now I know where I'm supposed to be. Good. Okay, so water lettuce and Pistia. So this is an old map from the USGS in 2011. And so at one time, it was designated as being invasive anywhere within the United States. And so that's what this map shows. The most extensive populations, if we look, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. And it has isolated populations elsewhere. There's even places in Idaho that it's found, because if there's any kind of thermal stream, if there's anywhere that's not going to freeze, then it can get established. And so it's a survivor. And it is, in some ways, a classic invasive species. And in Florida, it's still a class 1, it's a category 1 invasive species. Do that. Did it turn? Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. So why? So it does this. Okay. So water lettuce can form impressive meadows, very large meadows. And if you're trying to get a boat through this, it'll make you angry. Okay. And if you were to take an oxygen sensor and go into the middle of that mat, there's going to be very little oxygen because the leaves are covering up, right? And then there's going to be impressive mosquitoes that are going to be in this. Okay, so there's a lot of things about water lettuce to dislike. Okay, and now we're going to go into my life a little bit. So back, when I was 25 years old, and I still think I'm that age, which I'm not. But so August 2000, I moved to this area here, Ichetucknee Springs. I lived at the corner of Santa Fe River in Ichetucknee for my first year of graduate school. Beautiful spot. And my job was, I worked in Ichetucknee Springs State Park. I was an intern there. And so here's Ichetucknee. If you haven't been there, beautiful spot, beautiful springs up to the north of Gainesville, the northwest. And then I got something in the mail, and it was water lettuce cleanup, actually is my landlord. And he was, they are getting ready to spray the river is what they were worried about. And then I had been to Ichetucknee before, and when I was a kid, even before we knew what water lettuce was, you throw it that was the thing you'd hit people with, and and so I knew what water lettuce was, but then it had never been really considered to be a problem necessarily within the Ichetucknee River. But what DEP at the time was worried about is they're like, we're getting water lettuce in the Swanee River and it's causing problems there. And a big source is in the Ichetucknee, so we need to treat it at the source. Okay. And so here's just some quotes. DEP is it's a non-native species. It's only created minor problems on Ichetucknee, but again, in the Swanee, it's causing problems. And then they're like, we're going to start doing control here. Okay, what is an invasive species? This is a pretty knowledgeable group, I'm sure. So it's a species, so non-native to the ecosystem under consideration, and whose introduction is likely to cause some kind of harm, environmental, economic, some kind of harm, right, that we've defined, or even to human health, okay? And we know in conservation, invasive species, invasive exotic species are a big deal. We spend a lot of time trying to control them. And when I went to graduate school in ecology, invasive species and control of invasive species is something I knew a lot about. I spent time in Sarasota, and I hate Brazilian pepper, and I spent a lot of time treating Brazilian pepper there. So what do you think I did at Ichetucknee, right? And so when we think about it, so I'm going to talk about Daniel Simberloff, and we think about invasion ecology. The idea is when you have an invasive species, you kill it, you try to get rid of it, and then you ask questions later. Why? Because once they get established, the harms that can happen be very bad. And just think about pythons, right? Pythons, we wish whoever, the first python that got into South Florida, we wish someone would have killed those things so they wouldn't have gotten established. And so that's how we think of invasives. And that's what DEP and with water lettuce, that's the idea. And that's what the letter that I received when I was living down at Ichetucknee was all about, right? And so why? And so again, water lettuce will grow, and it will grow in canals, it'll grow. And what we know in terms of its ecology is often associated with nutrient enrichment. It loves nutrients. It will grow very, very fast. You add more nutrients and it exponentially grows. Incredibly productive, a lot like water hyacinth. One of the world's most absolutely productive plants when you add nutrients. And it also seems to like when we create ditches and hydrologic alterations, think of Florida, we've done a little bit of that in Florida. It likes those new habitats, and it tends to grow in ditches that have a lot of nutrients in them and cause problems. And so again, so navigation, things like mosquitoes, anoxia, I've already talked about this, so it can have problems. Overgrowth of Pistia can have problems, absolutely is the case. And so in Florida, it is a Category 1 invasive, and it is managed very aggressively, often with water hyacinth. So floating plant management, the idea is we go out, we try to control it at low levels because mostly worries of navigation, but also ecological issues, right? And so with a lot of ecosystems, typically twice a year, FWC, the Corps of Engineers, water management districts, others will go out, look for water lettuce and hyacinth, and we'll treat them. Okay, so now let's go back to Ichetucknee. Ichetucknee is a beautiful, beautiful place. So if you haven't been there, go there. It's really an amazing spot. I'm so lucky to have lived 1 year right there, right? I used to go snorkeling pretty much every day at Ichetucknee. And so it's really, really beautiful. And so you can think, okay, water lettuce and invasive, we should get rid of it, right? So that's the idea. So the original plan was for dicot herbicide within Ichetucknee. And I think it's safe to say that the folks around Ichetucknee and the stakeholders did not like that idea. Okay, so Ichetucknee had never really been treated with herbicides before. The idea of introducing herbicide treatment in this river was not popular. And at the same time, so Ichetucknee was in the news for something else. There was a whole cement plant that was built in that area. It was in the processes of actually being permitted at the time through the DEP. It was very unpopular. And just to sort of oversimplify, the DEP didn't want to take on another fight with Ichetucknee. They're like, we're already dealing with the cement plant. The idea of going and herbiciding the water lettuce is going to have people even more inflamed. So let's do something different. So what they did is we're going to do hand removal. We're going to go ahead and have a program where hand removal, and this started September 2000. Who do you think was the first volunteer to remove water lettuce at Ichtuckney? You know, me, right? So like, sounds like a great job. And so I go out there. I learned. I thought I was not allergic to ivy, poison ivy. Ichtuckney poison ivy disabused me of that notion. But so I did this. And so 3-4 times a week, I'd get up early in the morning, go out and I harvested water lettuce. That was my job. It was great. I loved the job. And so there's this thing here. Anything that says 2000 to 2001, this a water lettuce removal program, I did that. That was me, along with some other people. But we worked with the AmeriCorps volunteers, and we'd have big events, right? But I was out there. I was really effective at it. I was really good at removing water lettuce. And so here's just a picture. This is what we had, a little canoe, you know, and we, you know, I'd go out there with, recycle boxes and pile this stuff up. And then I would go and just put it up in the floodplain and hope it didn't flood and, you know, make it come back out again. But so that's what we did. And it was very effective. This was a very effective program. And so it was in the news, you know, we're out there getting rid of this life-sucking water lettuce, right? But I mean, I started having questions as I was doing it, as you would do, as any young ecologist might do, right? So where it really hit me originally was at this one here, Devil's Eye Spring, which is just a beautiful, beautiful spring. And so you can actually see 1989, that's water lettuce along the side. And it was known to come and go, right, within this area. And then Devil's Eye, right when I first was visiting this in 2000 and I was harvesting water lettuce, the eelgrass community was the most amazing eelgrass community I've ever seen. Just like beautiful, absolutely just gorgeous. And I dive in there and snorkel and like, this is like paradise, right? And I'm like, I got to get rid of this water lettuce. Okay. So then right after I'm successful, algae invades and then DEP even deploys and they're like, what's going on in Devil's Eye Spring? And I'm like, did I do that? And so, you know, start having this thought, right? Just start having some thoughts, okay? So yeah, this is Devil's Eye down here. And so, who knows? We weren't measuring the water quality. Who knows what happened? But that was the one thing that was clear to me. I'm like, it looked good. I did this, and all of a sudden, algae is where the water lettuce used to be, and it's also where the grass is. Ugh. And also, when I'd pick out the water lettuce, I was real careful because there'd be huge amounts of crayfish in it and like snails. And I'm like, these are good. And you put those back. This is bad. And then, you know, and I'm rationalizing in my head, I got to get rid of bad stuff, but keep the good stuff. I'm like, but the good stuff's living in the bad stuff. Rationalizing as you're doing it. Okay. Okay, and then March 2001, H.T. Odom. Has anyone ever met H.T. Odom? He died in 2002. So I watched a seminar by H.T. And so he was like the Einstein of ecology. He's like 6'5", you know, most brilliant person I think I've ever met. And so I had a class. I'm like, you got to go see this seminar by H.T. Odom, right? So I went to the Center for Wetlands. It wasn't called the H.T. Odom Center then, but I go and watch him give a talk about the Everglades restoration, and he was drawing these diagrams. I was like, I need to go hang out with this guy. So I sent him an email. I'm like, HT, I saw your talk. I'd love to go hang out with you. He's like, meet me tomorrow here, and I'm going to take you out in the field with me. And so I did. And I show up. I had on like nice shoes, and he's like, you're going to get those muddy. I'm like, okay. And then we drive out to his wetland. And so he had this like 1972 beat up Toyota thing. We're driving out. And this is what I'll never forget. So we're driving on Hawthorne Road. He's like, tell me what you're doing these days. I'm like, well, I'm harvesting water lettuce at Ichtuckney Springs. And I'll never forget, he starts screaming at me. And then he looks at me and he's driving and not paying attention anymore. He's like, there's 2 things wrong with that. I'm like, drive, don't crash. And he's like, 1, you're going to cause algae blooms. And this guy had written like about springs. He's like the master of springs ecology. He's like, 2, your whole premise is false. There's fossils, it's native. I'm like, okay. So I'm processing all this, right? I'm like, okay, wow. And so, and he was like famous, right? He had like won all these awards, was like, the Springs Institute is named after him now. He wrote this like seminal paper about Silver Springs, right? And he's yelling at me that water lettuce is native. And what I'm doing is absolutely positively the wrong thing to do. And so that made an impression. Okay. And so unfortunately, HT became sick not too long after that. And then to my discredit, I actually harvested more water lettuce. And I'm like, and then maybe he biased me and I'm like, I'm causing algae blooms. But I think he might have been onto something. Okay. And so finally I did say, I got to stop doing water lettuce harvest. Right. He got sick not too long after. And so, because this fossil, it just kept bothering me. I'm like, this fossil, but then he was no longer able to really talk about stuff. And so it just, I was working on other things and then passing away about a year later. But if there's anyone that was going to tell you something's native and that you should not be managing for that reason, HT was probably the worst person because he had a contrarian view of invasives. And let me just say, I do not share this view. This is just H.T. Odom's view of invasives. But he basically was like, invasives are fine. And as a matter of fact, we should spread more of them because they maximize power and do all these things. And we've already messed up the biosphere so much that they're going to actually create new patterns that are going to be fine. I do not subscribe to this. That's what his view was. But then when I tell people, H.T. Odom told me this was native, I'm like, he was a crackpot when it came to invasives, right? And he, probably was in some ways, okay? Even Einstein had crackpot ideas, okay? So there's that. But then, as time goes on, then in the same newspaper, it's no longer that we've got life-sucking water lettuce. Now we have a river in danger by algae. Algae blooms are just exploding all over Ichtuckney, right? Causing the grass to go down. And, the story is it's caused by nutrients, right? So we have a lot of loading of nitrate. But, this story, and I've worked on this as well, that obviously nitrate loading is not good into springs. And then we know within Ichtuckney that there has been increase in nitrate loading, but the nitrate since probably the mid 80s was already pretty elevated and it stayed pretty steady. Something happened in the early 2000s that flipped the system somehow, and then I started like, it's the water lettuce harvesting. We had this, and so I became the crackpot guy with water lettuce at UF. I was kind of, infamous in some ways about this, right? And so, and then I was going in the Center for Wetlands, going through H.T. Odom's notes, trying to figure out where this fossil was, could never find it. And so what we do know, if you look in the literature, water lettuce is oftentimes used in pond culture because it has algicides. It's really good at removing nutrients, luxury consumption of nitrogen and phosphorus. It takes more than it needs. Probably because it's trying to compete with algae, which is one of the few things that will try to compete with algae. And it's known to provide really good habitat for a bunch of things, endemic fish, crayfish, other aquatic species, even in Florida. And so, there are good aspects to it. And so there's some papers, to use it within stormwater treatment areas in Florida. There are some examples, I think, in Indian River County where they're using water lettuce for this purpose. And then within Ichtuckney, we started getting literature about, okay, the spring run crayfish started crashing right after we were removing the water lettuce. And I'm like, there were tons of those crayfish living in there. And so like, we're taking away its habitat, it might, and so this was the story, right? And so this is a systems model that I developed for my dissertation, kind of based upon H.T. Odom's work. We don't need to talk about that old stuff. Okay, but all that's, okay, it's nice, but this stuff's exotic, right? And we kill exotic species, right? We kill, so all these other things, right? Who cares? And so, Florida has a whole history of exotics: hydrilla, melaleuca, water hyacinth. Water lettuce is part of that category 1 invasive species, and who cares if it has these other functions, right? But William Bartram saw it in the 1700s, and he describes it very clearly in the Swanee and the St. Johns River. And so as I'm thinking about all this and reading and learning about water lettuce, and like, Bartram saw it, we usually use Bartram as our reference. And so why would this particular plant be considered to be exotic? And so he draws it and he writes about these meadows of Pistia. And so, okay, in 1765 and 1774. Okay, so there had actually been controversy. I wasn't the first one. H. Schodom wasn't the first one to think that Pistia was native. A lot of botanists actually said it's native because Bartram saw it, and then, but the literature is, you dig into it, is like, well, it was introduced by the Spanish sometime in the 16th, 18th century, and that's why Bartram saw it. There's no evidence for that claim. There's like zero evidence for that claim, none. All right, but that was the story. That's the story. Water lettuce is weird, and so its native range is worldwide in the tropics and subtropics, and so, for example, in Mexico, it's been confirmed 2,200 years ago. Ancient reports by the Romans and Greeks 2,000 years ago in the Nile. There's specialist herbivores in South America that suggest it's native there. There's specialist herbivores in Southeast Asia that suggest it's native there too. And then there's fossils that go back 35 million years within the Southeast US. They think the clade originated 85 million years ago down in these islands off of Africa. And so, and it stayed really stable over 85 million years, right? And so something that's in Pistia has been around that long, and it's like pan-global in areas that are warm enough to sustain it. And that's weird. That's very weird. Okay, so the thought was, okay, that the suspicions of Pistia actually being non-native started in the 1960s and 70s. Before that, it was assumed to be actually native. Funnily enough, a lot of the early literature talks about Pistia being outcompeted by water hyacinth. And so it was actually competitively excluded by hyacinth. And so there's even worry in some of the early literature, we're losing this one community to the much more aggressive water hyacinth, which is definitely non-native. But then in the 60s and 70s, we started getting better at controlling water hyacinth, and then water lettuce would almost immediately start and it'd be problematic, right? And so you can see we get really successful water hyacinth control in the 70s. And so it's basically with 2,4-D, but water lettuce is not very susceptible to 2,4-D. And so when we control for water lettuce, they typically use other formulations because the water lettuce, what you'd use to control the hyacinth doesn't really work very well with the Pistia. And so then, but then, okay, just because it's invasive, and it shows its behavior, you still need to explain what happened before Bartram, right? And then from an ecological point of view, you say, well, you release it from this invasive competitor, you have eutrophication, we know the species loves nutrients, then we've disturbed all this hydrology in Florida, and it's not surprising that it might explode, right? And it doesn't have to be exotic for that to happen. There's other examples of native species. Cattails are a good example, right? Cattails, at least as far as I can tell, the cattails in Florida are probably native, and they can be weedy when you add phosphorus, right? And so the means of, so we didn't know. USDA says possibly native to the US, or it may have arrived in ballast water. So that was the official story, right? And so ballast water, we know ballast has been important for some species. But it gets silly in some ways. Ballast water, the Spanish ships didn't use water ballast, right? They used stone ballast. And so it's like, okay, that's obviously wrong. That's just not true. And then you start, how, if you have dry ballast, how did this get in there? Is this a likely mechanism, right? Why? And we know that water lettuce is incredibly intolerant to salt. Then how did it survive? And so you start asking these questions. And then if you have the dry ballast sites where they're dropped up here, how did water lettuce end up down here, right? Of the bartrams, right? And so were people moving it around? Because it usually flows downstream where it spreads. So again, it doesn't exactly add up. It's not convincing, I think, when you give it this. But the most important work was actually insects that have to do with water lettuce. And so this was a very influential paper by Dre et al. And basically they showed that the highest diversity of insects that just eat water lettuce are in South America, and compared to Florida, we don't really have any specialists here. And so there's a lot that's going on with their paper, and then I criticize it in my own work. But here's the reasoning, that there's a high number of herbivores that just specialize on Pistia in Chaco, Argentina. If you look at Florida's Pistia, there's not any obligate herbivores that only eat the Pistia. And that would suggest that the water lettuce has been in Argentina longer than Florida. Okay. And then the idea is any Pistia that might have been in Florida went extinct sometime during the glacial maximum, right? The ice age would have wiped out the Pistia. And so then the timing of the reinvasion would be after the Spanish. Okay, that's pretty much the reasoning within their work. And so they also argue that if you look at water lettuce, there's a similar amount of herbivores that feed on it in Florida as in Chaco. The ones in Chaco are specialists. The ones here are generalists. So then the idea is it must be exotic here and native there. Okay, and so then they're like, if there were to be local specialists, it would have had to have been here at least 10,000 years. But let's think about this for a second. Native species, we typically think if it was here in 1492, it was native, right? If it was pre-Columbus, right? That's the way we typically define, whether that's right or wrong. Their whole reasoning, I looked at it and I spent so much time on this paper, I'm like, this is really good reasoning when you have your conclusion in mind, right? But then when you give it a little bit of skepticism, it doesn't hold together, at least in my view. And then Chaco is in a very biodiverse region. Florida, we like to think is biodiverse. Compared to South America, it's not. And so with areas where you have speciation and you have endemism, there are places like Archibald where there's a lot of endemism, but Florida isn't nearly as known for endemism as some places in South America. So I'm like, you can't do that. Okay. So I'm going to kind of skip through this a little bit, but basically with Dre et al., they also say if it had been present here continuously for 35 million years, which is when there were fossils in the Southeast, that it should have accumulated at least a few specialists. But think about that for a moment, right? So now the baseline is that for it to be native, it had to be here for 35 million years. We never apply that to any other species. And so think of like the tropical hammocks in the Keys, right? Most of those species in South Florida arrived probably after the glacial maxima, right? So native communities with natural climate change, things move around, right? And so again, rightly or wrongly, our usual baseline is about 500 years, if it's been here that long. This is saying 35 million would be the baseline, which I don't, that it's just not a good way to think of a native species, at least from my perspective. All right. So anyway, all of that, I had argued for years, we should have never considered this to be a non-native species. Because of Bartram, that we should have the null hypothesis is that it's native. And basically, I was ridiculed for years. And it's fine. I don't mind being ridiculed. I've got a very thick skin. But basically, everyone's like, "You're the crazy Pistia guy," And you spend way too much time thinking about that stuff, right? And then like I spent a year of my life harvesting that and maybe destroyed an ecosystem in the process. And so of course I'm going to think about this. All right. So I was at the University of Florida, and then that's where I did my PhD and postdoc work. And then I moved to UGA. And so it was my first faculty job. I went to the University of Georgia, and that was in 2010, working on biofuels, something different. I'm like, this invasive plant stuff, let me do something else for a while, because you know, not good for my career. You know, people are telling me I'm the crazy guy. That's probably not good. And so let's do something else. And so I did. And so then I went to UGA, and then I had a lull between projects. And so they're like, just work on whatever you need to work on. I'm like, okay, Pistia, how about I work on that again? And so I would go to the UGA library all the time and just would search for Pistia, Florida, looking for new stuff. I'm like, HT's fossil must be there. And all of a sudden, this newly digitized paper from 1917 in the Journal of Geology by Edward Berry, I find it, and I celebrated, because Pistia spathulata was in this site in the fossil plants from Vero Beach. And then if you look through the strata, which it was like very poor stratigraphic methods that he used, but probably in sediments between 3,500 to 12,000 years, that's the range. Not a great range, right, if you're trying to do paleoclimate reconstruction, but for me, like, that's good enough, right? There's Pistia, and he describes it, and it's there, and it's just, he matter-of-factly notes that it's there. I'm like, okay, it's here, right? It was here. All these other plants are native to Florida, and there's Pistia, right? And so I started writing a paper about it, right? And I actually submitted the paper, and it got rejected several times. They're like, Barry was a crackpot, you know, you're relying on that, you know, come on. And so I despaired again, you know, I had to go back to work on biofuels again. And so, all right, so there's just a Pistia, and it's the same Pistia, you know, spathulata and stratiotes, they're the same thing. It's just different ways of talking about it. Okay, so yeah, and then the response from the reviewers was exactly this. Why didn't Bill Watts ever find this stuff? Because he cored lakes all over Florida. He didn't find it. Therefore, if it was in Florida, it would have been in one of those lakes. Like, okay, darn it, okay. And I'd read a bunch of Bill Watts. I knew about the Lake Annie work. And so, you know, so I'm like, okay, I'll put that away. But I would still continue to search around whenever I had a spare moment. And then I find this paper by Quillen, right? It was maybe like 3 or 4 months after my paper had been rejected, and I'm despairing. And I see this work about Lake Annie. And sure enough, I don't think I have it highlighted here, but it talks about Pistia pollen is in the Holocene sediments of Lake Annie, and at like 11,000 years or older. And I'm like, okay, now we have it in Lake Annie, and we have it with Barry. And so then I write another, and so then I write my paper, I submit it to a different journal. Took forever to get it published. Finally got it published. And then, so this is hard to see, but then to Archibald, you know, I went to found it, and then Pistia is reported within the that's what I'm thinking. And so anyway, I had written this paper, but when I wrote about it within the Quillen et al. Work, they said pollen. They said Pistia pollen. And so, yeah. Okay. Do I need to swap? Okay, great. Or did that one die?
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. All right. Okay. So microphone fail. We got a new one. Hopefully you guys hear this. Okay. So I'd written this paper, and then I talked about UGA and UF, and then it's telling someone earlier. So it was great to write this at UGA because as soon as they found out, like some of the press people were like, "Is that going to make UF mad that you published this paper?" I'm like, "Probably," and they're like, "We're going to promote it." And so yeah, so they put it out, you know, UGA Today, you know, and it really, I think their whole motivation was that we're going to stick it to UF, right? And so, and then the Orlando Sentinel actually wrote a little thing about it, which is my hometown paper. And so my mom was so proud that it was in the Orlando Sentinel. But then then it started, it was making people angry, right? And they're like, like people were saying, and I was actually getting ready to move from UGA to Stetson. So I was coming back to Florida right as this was in, right was in the newspapers. And again, it's like, you're the crazy guy again, talking about this water lettuce. And now you're in the news and like this pollen. And so anyway, I really needed to figure this out some more, right? And what happened, and we were talking earlier about the biocontrol lab, right? So one of the things that happened is that the USDA overreacted, right? So I had my paper come out, and they basically said, okay, Pistia is native everywhere in the US now. And then they basically shut down the biocontrol program for water lettuce in Fort Lauderdale, which was Alan Dre's lab, the guy who had critiqued, right? And so they obviously weren't happy about that, right? And then, and the USGS was a little bit more nuanced. They're like, okay, Florida Peninsula, it's native, but elsewhere, non-native, that's probably more, that's a better way of thinking about it. And I'm like, I didn't mean to shut down the biocontrol lab. Whoops. But then, within the Orlando Sentinel, I actually gave a seminar, and people from UF were like, yes, we are angry. And then that berry thing, we don't believe that. This thing at Lake Annie, we don't believe that either. What evidence do you have for this? I'm like, okay. So then I reached out to Eric Grimm. And then, so the USDA, I'm going to talk about this paper, that they actually started doing a study with genetics. So we want to actually see the genetics of water lettuce and food, right, and actually study this. This is one of the things I recommended in my paper. And in fairness to myself, I was like, there's probably exotic lineages too. I wrote that in my paper, right? And probably introduced stuff as well. There's examples of this all around the world of these kind of things. And so they ended up doing this study. It was a great study. But then, so Eric Grimm, so I reached out to him soon after I got to Stetson, and such a nice guy. And so he sent me this, and he's like, yeah, we've got this unpublished data, and yeah, there's Pistia all over the place. Bill Watts, that was the second most common thing in the sediment, matter of fact. And the things were really, there's no way you could confuse Pistia with anything else, especially not Bill Watts. These things look like little whiskey barrels, is what they call them. And so, you can see it. It's down there within the sediments. And as a matter of fact, they even had some pictures of them, right? And so these are the Pistia seeds. And then they actually radiocarbon dated some of the Pistia seeds themselves. And so they were 14,000 years old, 13,000 years old here in Lake Annie. I'm like, if that's not native, what is, right? And then, so what happened and so if we look back at Lake Annie, let's go and even look at this a little bit. There's all these other plants, and then all the other plants that are listed are native plants in Florida, right? We consider them all to be native. But you look at Lake Annie, and way back when, there were all these different plants and seeds, including the Pistia, and then they trailed off, right? And then, so then you don't see hardly any of these macrofossil aquatic plant seeds. And so what happened? All right, so a little quiz for you all. What happened to Lake Annie's plants? I'm sure you know. So it happened, about 11,000 years ago is when there was a big transition that started happening in Lake Annie. Sea level rise, right? And so I oftentimes give talks about sea level rise and this, and then I'll use a Monty Python thing now for something completely different. But yes, it's a sea level rise story, right? It is a sea level rise story. And so what happened is that the sea rose very, very quickly. There were some ice melts, and then it caused Lake Annie to go up in stage. And it went from probably a shallow eutrophic-ish type pond that would dry out periodically to a shallow oligotrophic lake. And then, so all of the plants that required the hard water, nutrients, all that, they all fell out, right? And that included Pistia, right? It fell out. And so, yeah, there's Lake Annie. And so, of course, Lake Annie's cool because it's on the ridge, and it's one of these lakes that a lot of the paleoclimate people like to go study because it's held water. I think the oldest core goes back to 40,000 years, the original Watts paper. Very cool lake. And what had happened with the core that had the water lettuce in it, Watts and Grimm, they never really published that because they had another core at Lake Tulane, and then that one went back far, like 60,000 years. And then they published a lot on that one. And they actually, well, when they came down, they were really going to Lake Tulane. And so I actually talked to George Jacobson, and he said that they came down to Lake Annie. So like, well, we're down here, let's go do that one too. But apparently there's a layer that's very hard to get through in Lake Annie, and they couldn't penetrate. So they only got down to 14,000 years. And so they were kind of disappointed with Lake Annie, but they're like, fortunately we have Lake Tulane, and they published a bunch of paleoclimate papers about Lake Tulane. But the water lettuce, there's a little bit of knowledge they had that it might have been important, but it wasn't important enough to actually publish on it. And so, yeah, all these other plants, we consider them to be native, but then so it's a little odd, to have Pistia down here. That's non-native, and it got to be even, when I first, when I had all this, started presenting on it, then I have people say, well, maybe it went extinct after they saw it in Lake Annie. And I'm like, okay, and they're like, maybe it got colder. I'm like, no, the younger Dryas in South Florida, it was warming period here still. And so the idea, like Pistia is so nasty invasive, we have to have all these control programs, but also so dainty that for some reason we're going to assume it went extinct in Lake Annie. That kind of starts to get on the silly side. So I'm going to turn the tables. I'm no longer the crazy Pistia guy. I think my argument's stronger, right? We need to have a better argument. And so, here's all the places, we've got the Vero site, we've got Lake Annie, we've got the Bartram sightings. To me, basically, this stuff spread through Florida, right? And it makes good sense that would be the most Occam's razor I like to use, most parsimonious, far less assumptions, having to think of Spanish ships and freezes that didn't occur in the paleo environment and all these other things. No, it was here and then it spread. Okay, and then USDA, so they did publish, they actually took several years working on this work, right, genetics work, and Paul Madeira, who he might be online right now, and I consider him a dear friend, right? I got to visit him in Fort Lauderdale several years ago. He bought me some great beer, and we had a rousing debate about water lettuce. And then through very little funding, almost no funding probably, they published this work and then went through it. And what they found is, it's a great paper. It's just a wonderful paper. I love reading it. What they found is that, yeah, water lettuce in Florida, the genetics of it, there are several haplotypes in Florida. And one of them, the E clade, is likely native, and because there's a lot of diversity amongst it, and it tends to be in springs. It tends to be in Florida Springs, much like Ichtuckney, right? And I see it in springs all the time, and where there's water lettuce, it forms a pretty unique community. And their work kind of jives with that. They did find some that looks to be non-native, that looks like it was introduced from some other areas, I believe Argentina. And then there's a third clade, which it's debatable as to whether or not it's native or not native, and that's the one that's in blue. But it seems pretty clear once you have the fossil evidence, and now we've got this genetics work, that yeah, there's some native water lettuce out there. And so then, of course, the question is, how did it get here? And so this is my hypothesis, is I think water lettuce basically serves like the wastewater treatment plant in the paleo world for bird rookeries. It loves high nutrients, it loves it, loves it, loves it, loves it. And so probably over paleo time, a little bit of water lettuce seed gets stuck in a bird, the bird flies, it sloughs off a feather, or gets eaten by an alligator or whatever at a rookery, and then water lettuce can spread within those high nutrient environments. In Paleo Florida was mostly oligotrophic. We have definitely eutrophied Florida, right? So water lettuce is undoubtedly more common now than it would have ever been in the Paleo. But this is what I think, right? And I think, and the migratory pathways. And then, so someone even asked me, I think on LinkedIn the other day, like, why did it escape from these herbivores? Like a bird, a bird flies over the Gulf of Mexico and drops it. It's not going to bring the herbivores with it, right? And so that's my hypothesis. Is I think that's how it's been successful over millions of years. And I will say, water lettuce doesn't seed regularly. We're looking for seeds all the time. I have students looking for seeds, and when it's happy, it doesn't seed. It just loves to spread vegetatively. You have to stress it for it to seed. It seems. And I will say that Eric Grimm, who was just a wonderful person, who I never met in person, we talked several times on the phone, and he shared his data. He passed away a few years ago, and it was very, very sad. And I just want to say kind of tribute to Eric for sharing all the data. I mean, he was so encouraging to me, and just one of these things of just who's a giant in science, who's just one of the nicest people I think I've ever known. So just want to put that tribute up there to him. I want to thank you all and open it up for questions. Hopefully I didn't go on for too long here. Yeah. No. A water hyacinth is definitely not native. It was introduced in the 1880s in Florida. The introduction pathway is very, very clear. Came, I believe, as the World Fair is when they were spreading Eichhornia all around the world in the late 1800s. And we can almost trace it to a person in Jacksonville who threw it out in the St. Johns River. And so very, very clear that Eichhornia is non-native. Zero doubt about that. And I looked at the plant, we all native plants in Florida, and I think water lettuce is on it. So that explains how water lettuce is scattered around. Yep. Yep, that's right. That's right. And so, yeah, certainly we've spread it around. And then you can buy water lettuce. You go up north. I think you can even buy it in Georgia, and I think you can buy water hyacinth in Georgia, which is not a good idea. Let me just be clear about that. Yeah.
I was curious, is there a gap in the fossil record for their sites? You have that gap between that and what about it? Can you explain what happened? Do you see that in the other sites?
I need to look at the records there, the paleo records, and then so you mean in terms of the lakes?
We got a 10,000-year gap at this site, but is that true at the other site?
Yeah, is it Lake Tulane? Do you know much about Lake Tulane? Is there that same sort of gap there? No, at least it's not. At least it's not within the published list. Yeah. Yep. Interesting. It could be. Yeah.
Oh, it's great. I was thinking about how the diatoms down there at the bottom of the Solon were really acidic loving diatoms that live attached. And, they would love a kind of dark wetland.
Yep.
But they're also really super lithotrophic.
Interesting.
I think it's interesting that the lake actually has a lot more phosphorus today than it did back then. And I think it's peculiar that this was it all happened there, and that it is not at all happy now. And as you're talking about this, I just the likelihood that there's something has changed about the population. And
yep.
I just don't see that can be happening. Yes, but unless there were periods that were
Yeah, and I want and so what I think when it was seeding, right? The fact that there's all this Pistia seeding, what I've noticed when it seeds, so I've had students looking for it to seed, and then it doesn't. It's very rare that it seeds. But then we had this flooding after Hurricane Ian, and then it spread the Pistia up in the floodplain. As it dried out and it was stressed and unhappy, huge amounts of seed production. And so I wonder if it was like living in an unhappy state there, maybe potentially, and then that's what was, and maybe drying out. But this is all just speculation as to what it might have been doing. That's interesting. I actually did ask Paul Madeira at one time if we could actually genetically test of the fossils to see, how it might relate. And then I think it's not easy. I know is that's I think of the simple. Yeah. Oh, okay. So maybe they could be genetically tested.
Is Eric fatal
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I am a little curious whether macroscopic work quite a completely different.
That's
curious about that.
Yeah. What I do know is that with the macro fossils, I know that was all Bill Watts. That was all Bill Watts, and so we actually had to make the request from the College of Dublin to get. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yes, Trinity College of Dublin. We had to make the request to get the imagery, and so whether or not Watts actually did, do you know if he did macrofossil work in Lake Tulane? Okay, I'd have to read it again too. Yeah, I'm not sure. I know on some of that on the other papers, because I went through them all looking for Pistia, of course, and then he doesn't describe Pistia in any of the other lakes. And I think there are some macrofossils in some of his other papers. Yeah.
Asked a question from the online folks. I think it's Alex Du. He asked, so what's the deal? Why are there no special services?
So there's a lot of herbivores. Okay.
There are lots of insects that don't occur even locally everywhere where their hosts are.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you had an herbivore that had a semi-aquatic stage, it wouldn't be in the wall-to-wall Pistia places.
Yeah.
It would be along your springs, probably.
Yeah.
So, and I'm sure when they were looking for them, they were looking in the wall-to-wall Pistia.
Okay.
So you would go to where you might think it originally was.
Yep.
And check there because there's areas that are like nothing but a meadow with Pistia. That's not really a natural system.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it could be surveying, maybe if we looked harder for this stuff, we might find them. But the other piece as well is that there are a lot of generalist herbivores on it. And so there are things that are eating it. And so, to get specialists and to get, those kinds of evolutionary sort of processes are, how that happens, it's kind of idiosyncratic to the areas, that kind of thing. So just because you don't have a specialist doesn't mean that it's not native, I guess would be my point. And then, yeah, I guess to your point, there's not a lot of ecological work about water lettuce, to actually what lives in it. A lot of it, when I talk with FWC people, when I've kind of given some of this talk, the fish people, they talk about, wow, there's a lot of some of like the rare rare minnows and rare fish like to live under water lettuce. We've noticed that, but there's not study because, you know, it gets the biases of ecological research too. There's some things a weed like water lettuce, the idea of going and studying its community. It's like, no, you study it to go kill it. You know, you study it, you're not studying it because that's just not something we typically do. It's very rare to study something that's an invasive plant, like what are the unique things that live on it, right? Because that's just not a question that would come up. So yeah, so I think that would be great, you know, to go some of these springs, Ichitucknee and some of these other springs. Actually, Silver Springs, H.T. Odom described in his famous paper, he described the water lettuce there being attacked seasonally, that it would grow and then it would disappear because insects were attacking. And that was back in the 50s. And whether that was a generalist or that was one of the specialists, you know, he didn't really say, but I've seen it in other springs as well, like Gum Slough, which is one of the areas that shows that it is native, right? And I actually collected that and sent it to Paul, and it's one that actually shows as the haplotype that's native. That I watch it there, it gets attacked, right? You have water lettuce, and it'll be there, and then it'll disappear, and it'll come back. And then it's not herbicides, that it's actually insects attacking. And then what those are, I'm not an entomologist, but yeah.
Obviously, it's not invasive. We know now that it's native practice is invasive because it's potential efforts clearly to remove it. Now that it's native, it doesn't necessarily mean I think it's a bad thing that it's doing go away. What do you think this human role is in maintaining that, and do you think that it's going to shift back on the cycle with the insects?
We are clearly going to continue managing it. And so like the Corps of Engineers, for example, you know, up in the St. John's where I live, that, you know, their charge there is actually for navigation. And they actually they're fairly indifferent as to whether or not it's native or not, right? And so they're like it's navigation. Where I think that the conversation may shift is going to be in some of these areas where we do have where we have clearly native populations, like in some of the spring runs, that we may be able to shift the conversation there to say, let's back off a little bit. We don't need to do, you know, the maintenance control is what it's called, where you try to keep it at the lowest possible population, right? But if there's areas like, say, Ichitucknee, right, and let's say, okay, if it's not really causing problems in that system or major problems, then maybe you back off, you know, and let it kind of persist a bit and study it and say, what is living in this and what are the habitat values of it? That conversation is still kind of going. And so, Paul, you had your hand up, I think, right? So the paper there with Paul Madero is great. And so, as I understand, I'm not an expert either, but the way I've read through that paper is you basically look at how much diversity there is within the genes that are kind of related within that area. And so if you have a lot of spread within your genetics within an area versus you have another area that has like the same sort of like haplotype, but you have very little diversity within the haplotype, you'd assume the area where there's wider diversity, that's where it's native. And where it's kind of narrower, then you might assume that's where it's at least been more recently introduced. And so it gives you this kind of length of spread. And so when something's been in an area longer, it has just longer time to kind of diversify its genetics. That we don't know. And that's one of the questions actually that they raise within their paper, the genetics paper, is we don't really know. There's some speculation that maybe with biocontrols that the exotic ones may be, you know, less susceptible, or it could be more susceptible. And I know they tried to bring in some biocontrols from Southeast Asia that weren't very successful here in Florida. And the idea is there's even thought now within their paper that there may actually be more than one species of Pistia worldwide. We had thought it was one species, but then the stuff in Asia, as you might suspect, is pretty distinct from what's in the Americas. And so the idea that it was one species, because it all looks really similar. And if you go out and if you try to like is this the native versus the non-native one in Florida? No one's yet described that to my knowledge that you could go out and like just look at it and see it. I think you'd have to do the genetics testing and how one responds to nutrients, how one might be susceptible to herbicides. You know, there's been that evolutionary control, or that there's been that, of course, process we've been. And so there's all these questions that they don't really have any good answers. We haven't really researched.